Okay, welcome to part 3 and the final piece of our learning unit. Today what we're going to be talking about is actually two pieces, but I'm just going to put them all together in one video. So first we're going to talk about cognition in conditioning. So connecting kind of the cognitive aspects to what we've already talked about with classical conditioning and operant conditioning. And then after that, we're going to look at observational learning. So we'll see that towards the end. So, cognition and conditioning. So this first piece is just kind of a little bit of an introduction, right? So basically, at the very beginning, researchers believed that conditioning was just an automatic response, right? That the way classical and operant conditioning went is it was just an automatic thing that you did, whatever, you carried out that operant conditioning, and it was just going to automatically happen. So over time, and today, we've seen kind of some shifts and changes, and we're going to talk about what kind of those things are. But basically, that thought process has shifted a little bit, where now we believe that conditioning does involve some of what we call information processing, which for psychology is cognition, right? So how do we process the actual information that we're receiving from the world in all these different ways? So let's look at that a little bit in some ways that we see that. So one of them is what we call latent learning. So latent learning is learning something without the presence of a reinforcer and not showing the behavior right away. Okay, so we learn something, but there isn't necessarily something reinforcing us to learn it, and it's not something we show right away. A simple example of this would be something like a cognitive map. So a cognitive map is a mental representation that allows an organism to acquire, store, and recall information in a real or spatial environment. So here's kind of the example that we can give and actually how this was discovered or why we believe that there's this cognitive aspect to what's going on with our conditioning. So for example, they've used, obviously you've heard about mice doing different kinds of mazes to test, all sorts of different things. I'm sure you've seen that kind of image, at least in somewhere, when you think about science, right? So there's been some research that's been done where they basically take a mouse or a rat and they put them in the maze, but there isn't anything at the end. Basically, they just let them explore the maze, however they want to explore. So they just kind of, walk around, figure out where things are, just kind of wander around the maze. Then later on, they would test those mice, but now they would have something at the end, right? So some sort of reward at the end that would reward them for getting there. And what they found was that the mice who were allowed to explore the maze beforehand did better than the mice who did not. Now, what this tells us is that those mice were actually learning the maze, even though there wasn't anything rewarding them for doing so. They were learning the maze just by being in the maze. Another way that we can see this that's very simple is we all have cognitive maps ourselves. So all of you right now, if I asked you to close your eyes and picture the school building, right, and try and mentally draw a map of where everything is in the building, you could probably do a pretty decent job. Now you might not be able to label every single classroom or anything like that, but you'd probably have a pretty good idea, even of things that you've never needed to go to or any places that you've ever been, right? There's a lot of you that could probably tell you or tell yourself or map out where maybe certain parts of the music or the theater classrooms are, even if you've never had one of those classes, right? So that's this idea of this cognitive map and latent learning, that we are learning things even though there's no reward directly for doing so, and if there's not we don't need to show the behavior. So we can learn things without immediately showing the behavior. If you remember when we talked about behaviorism was only talking about what are the things that we can see. So for a behaviorist, Pavlov wasn't again a psychologist, but maybe John B. Watson, right? They wouldn't be looking at this at all. They didn't believe that anything mattered outside of what we actually see happening. Okay, so that's where we're adding these pieces in. In addition, we have what is called insight learning. So insight learning is going to be discovered by Wolfgang Kohler. Insight learning is where we see a sudden realization of a problem solution. You can kind of think of it that we always show it as the light bulb going on, or where it's you just suddenly have an answer out of nowhere. That's what we call insight learning. I'm just going to read that second bullet point for you before I kind of give you an example of this as well. So stimulus response conditioning alone is not responsible for behavior. Some level of unobservable cognitive processes are at work. And that's the idea behind this, that basically there is, these observable stimulus response conditioning going on. We know that. But there's also some level, and it depends, what the problem is, what the organism is that we're talking about, but there is some level of unobservable cognitive processes, right? Your brain is doing some sort of work outside of just connecting those two things and making an association. So the way that this was actually discovered, or kind of the most famous experiment, is one you're seeing in this bottom right corner here. These are actual pictures of it. So basically what they did is they had a chimpanzee, I believe it is, and they put them in a room, and it's a little hard to see, but at the very top of the room they have like a bundle of, I believe it's bananas, a bundle of bananas hanging from the ceiling. Now, as you can see, the chimpanzee cannot reach the bananas. So basically what they do is they leave them in there, and what happens is at first the chimpanzee tries a whole bunch of stuff, right? They might grab a stick, or they might pick up the boxes or throw stuff at it. They jump up and try and get it. They try a whole bunch of things. Eventually, right, they kind of run out of ideas. And so what happened is the chimpanzee tried stuff for, a few minutes, I believe, and then they basically kind of gave up. And they just kind of went off and, sat around and did other stuff. And what happened was at some point, all of a sudden, kind of out of nowhere, the chimpanzee just stood up, walked over, picked up the box you can see in that second picture, stacked all the boxes on top of each other, and then stood on top of them and got the bananas. Right? Now, what's important about this was this was something that was happening cognitively. So the chimpanzee wasn't necessarily trying anything when suddenly they got the answer to their problem. They just suddenly seemed to have it. And we do this thing all the time. So one example of this is when you're like struggling with a problem, and it can be something simple like recalling a piece of information. It can be something more complex like trying to solve like a math problem or trying to solve some sort of problem in your life. And at some point maybe you just kind of give up and you're just like, I just don't know what to do, and you kind of just give up. And then maybe later you're like sitting around and maybe you're not doing anything at all, right? You're just like laying in bed or whatever, and then suddenly the answer just pops into your head. That's this insight learning. And the idea is that even when we aren't maybe actively working on something, our brain is still working on that solution, right? There is a cognitive process that's going on that's solving problems outside of what we are physically doing, what our behavior is showing. Okay, again, this is really important because at the time, right, behaviorists really only cared about behavior. They didn't care about anything else. If you couldn't see it, they said it wasn't happening. So this is an important kind of shift. This also gets us to a few other things that we see. So mainly what we call the locus of control. So there's an internal and an external locus of control, and they're basically just opposites of each other. So an external locus of control is referring to the perception that chance or outside forces beyond our personal control determine our fate. Okay, so again, the perception that chance or outside forces beyond our personal control determine our fate. So the idea here is basically just, do I believe that something else controls the fate of my life? It doesn't matter what that other thing is. It can be fate on its own. It can be God. It can be spirits. It can be luck. It can be literally whatever you want, right? The question is do you believe, do you have a perception that something outside of yourself is going to determine what happens to you, right? Chance can also be it, that it's just all up to chance. Now, that is the opposite of what is called an internal locus of control. So an internal locus of control is the perception that you control your own fate. Okay, now I'm going to give you an example in just a moment, but one of the really important things is basically these perceptions can change how we act and how we learn things. So whether or not I have this perception of being in control or not being in control determines a lot about how I act. It determines a lot about how I learn. So again, what we're seeing here with both of these is how a internal mental process, right, or perception changes my behavior. Okay, and that's again the important thing we're looking at. These are also very closely tied with what's called self-control. You guys probably already all know what self-control is. The ability to control impulses and delay short-term gratification for greater long-term rewards. We'll look at an example of this. It's the video right there of children where they're kind of experimenting with self-control. Self-control is something obviously that we get as we get older, generally speaking. And then obviously different people have different levels of self-control in addition to that. So this is a big important connection that I want to make to our external and internal locus of control. So one thing that we can see is what is called learned helplessness. So learned helplessness is very much kind of a extreme version of an external locus of control. All right, so again, it's where we do not believe that we are in charge of what's happening. We're not in control. So to give this specific definition, right, learned helplessness is a mental state in which an organism continues to experience a painful, unpleasant, or aversive stimulus. So what happens here is basically the organism learns that they are helpless. Okay, so I'm just going to read that bottom part. Because they have learned that regardless of their actions, they have no ability to change the outcome. So an example of learned helplessness, and the reason there's a dog, we'll watch a video on this as well. But the main kind of example that was done in psychological research was where a researcher took dogs and they put them in kind of like a Skinner box, but obviously bigger, to fit a dog. And there was a little bit difference in kind of how they looked. So they had different types. Some of them, they would have like something like a button to, push. Some of them would be able to like jump from one side. There would be like two separate sides and they could jump over a little divider and get into the other side. And then other ones, they would just kind of have like the classic kind of Skinner box. Okay. And what they would do is they would basically administer a electrical shock to the dog. Now, again, these are not like going to kill the dog or anything, but it's you're getting shocked still, so it's unpleasant, right? You kind of think of it like a shock collar maybe. But they would put that in the floor. So some of the dogs, they would be able to, push a button or flip a lever or whatever, and that would stop the shock. Some of them would be able to jump from one side over to the other side, and the other side wouldn't be shocked. Some of them, though, wouldn't be able to do anything to stop the stimulus. Okay? So what happened is over time, those ones that were unable to do anything to stop the the electrical shock, they just learned to be helpless. So basically, after a point, they would administer the electrical shock, and the dog wouldn't do anything. It just got shocked. It wouldn't try to get away. It wouldn't try to stop it. It wouldn't do anything. It just gave up. And that's what learned helplessness is, right? This idea that, or this mental state, I guess, that a person or an animal believes that they have no ability to escape or no control over what happens to them. So because they can't do anything, they learn to just be helpless and just not do anything at all. Okay? We'll watch kind of a video that's going to talk about that. It's going to give a few other examples as well of, how we've seen learned helplessness in humans and animals. Okay, so I'm going to continue the video, but this is a good time to maybe pause and do just a very quick summary of the connections between cognition and conditioning. Okay, again, those will very much be connecting to our operant conditioning and our classical conditioning. Once you're done with that, we're going to continue on. So now we're going to start looking at and talking about observational learning. Observational learning. So observational learning, what is it? It is learning that occurs through observation, right? Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. So we observe the behaviors of others and then we imitate those behaviors. Now, again, this is something where we are seeing this happen even if there's not reinforcement at the time. Okay, so even if we watch somebody do something and there's no reinforcement for them or for us, we can still learn to copy those behaviors. This tends to be very common during childhood as children learn from the authority figures and peers in their lives. So again, it's really simple to think about if you've ever been around a little kid or if you have a younger sibling, especially if they're much younger than you, they probably have gone through phases at least where they imitate your behaviors, right? They want to dress like their parents or their older siblings. They want to talk like them. They want to do the things they do. If you think about kids' toys, there's a reason that they make a lot of things that aren't toys, like lawnmowers. Lawnmowers aren't a toy for an adult, but to a little kid it is because they want to imitate, right, their mom or their dad or whoever's mowing the lawn. Same thing with things like kitchens or dolls that you like take, like babies. All those things are kind of about imitation. We're imitating our parents and those people around us, but we are learning through that, right? That observation is through learning. So one thing that's very interesting about this is there's actually a biological kind of connection, and there is to all this stuff, but a very nice, neat one for observational learning. And that is because we have what are called mirror neurons. So we'll watch a little video that's going to talk about them a little more in depth. But basically, mirror neurons are nervous system cells, right, that fire not only when we do something, but also when we watch somebody else do something. So I believe I played a video early on in the sensation perception unit, or maybe at the very end of the biological unit. And what it talked about is that when we imagine ourselves doing something, the same parts of our brain light up as if we actually are physically doing it. We see some of the same things here, that when we watch somebody do things, some of the same parts of our brain light up when we watch somebody as when we are actually doing it. So again, this is kind of a biological connection about why we learn by observing, why we learn by watching other people. One of the most important kind of research studies that is done as far as observational learning goes, or at least most influential, is by Albert Bandura. Bandura is another one of those psychologists that they do expect you to know. The big ones from this unit are Pavlov, Watson, and Bandura. Those are the ones that come up a lot, and Skinner as well, actually, I'm sorry, and Skinner. Those are kind of the big ones. So Bandura did the experiment that is often just called like the Bobo doll experiment. Okay, this is the Bobo doll right here. You can see him in this image. So the Bobo doll is this kind of like clown doll thing. It's blown up. And basically what they did is they would show children videos, or sometimes in person, they would show them a adult going in and beating up this Bobo doll, basically, right? They'd like throw it around, kick it, punch it, do all that kind of stuff. And then what they would do is they would let the child go into that room later on. And what they wanted to see is, what will they do? And what he found was a connection between what the kids saw and how they acted. So if the children saw someone being aggressive towards the Bobo doll, they were more likely to also be aggressive. Now, there was a whole bunch of other pieces, and I think actually it's on the next slide. I'm going to talk to you about them. But basically, again, it's just this idea of that children are going to imitate. They're going to learn by observing, and then they're going to imitate us. So with that, though, there's a whole bunch of kind of other things. So this is not stuff that you necessarily need to have down word for word or your notes or anything, but it's something that I do like to kind of go over because there's so many kind of factors. So Bandura did this research like a whole bunch of different ways. He basically changed little parts of his experiment, a whole bunch of different times, and looked at a bunch of different factors. So this is kind of some of the results. So these are factors that are going to increase the likelihood that a behavior will be imitated. Okay, so when we have these things, we're more likely to see a behavior be copied than if maybe we don't. So, for example, people who are in an authoritative position in our lives. So somebody like a parent, a police officer, someone with power, a teacher, a principal, those kind of things have authoritative power positions. So those people we're going to be more likely to imitate. People who are of similar age, sex, and interest. So if someone's similar to us in those ways, we're more likely to imitate them. People who we admire or who we have or who are of a high social status. So someone who's popular or who we look up to. When the situation is confusing, ambiguous, or unfamiliar. So for example, like I always think of this one when kids show up to school. It's not uncommon for us to get like partway through the school year and to have a new student in class. And one of the things that often happens is, especially if that student's from like out of state or maybe even out of the country, that first day that they walk into class, if you next time this happens, you kind of pay attention, what you'll notice is the first thing they're going to do is they're going to walk in and they're going to look around at what everybody else is doing. What they're looking for is, what am I supposed to do here? Right? So if we're in a situation that is unfamiliar, or you don't know what to do, or it's ambiguous, what you're going to do is you're going to look around for other people, and then you're going to imitate those other people. People we perceive as warm and nurturing are also more likely for us to imitate. People who receive rewards for their behavior. So if we see somebody get rewarded for doing something, we are more likely to do it. When you've been rewarded for imitating behavior in the past. So maybe I saw somebody do something, I copy it, and then I get a reward. Well, now I'm going to continue to do that. And then lastly, when we lack confidence in our own knowledge or abilities. So if I'm, for example, like doing something I've never done before, and I don't think I'm going to do very well, and there's this other person, right, I'm going to be more likely to imitate them because I'm not confident in what I think or what I'm going to do. So again, these are all things that are more likely to increase. Now, as always, this stuff is never 100%, but it just makes it more and more and more likely that we're going to imitate this observed behavior. All right, this gets us to what is called modeling. Modeling is a very important type of, or strategy, of learning. This is one of the biggest things that we use to teach. This is probably something that you will almost definitely use to teach in your project that you guys have, that you're working on, your teaching project. So what is it? Modeling is showing how something is done. Sounds exactly what it looks like, or exactly what you would think it would be. Basically what's happening is learning is taking place in a social context and as a cognitive, with a cognitive kind of basis. So we are observing what's happening, there's a social aspect, and there's also a cognitive aspect of me, copying what I'm seeing. So I'm showing somebody how to do something. Okay, again, you can think of little kids, right? So it's not uncommon for, dad to go out and mow the lawn and the little boy to go out and mow it with them, or a little girl to go out with them, or for a dad to, show his son how to shave, or, for a mom to teach her daughter how to put on makeup or something like that, even before they need to, right? But they're going to do it by modeling, by showing it. Here's how you do this. Now, there's different types or different kind of pieces that can be connected. So, for example, we can have what is called vicarious learning. So, vicarious learning is using this model behavior, right? So, this model is exhibiting a behavior, and then it is observed and interpreted by a viewer who can then imitate it. Okay? Vicarious learning, very simple, is basically like I do something, and then you do it. Okay? That's basically it. Right? So you watch me do something, and then you go and you can copy that thing. That is vicarious learning. I'm learning through the actions of this other person. Okay? This, again, is a really common way that we teach people pretty much everything. And this does not necessarily just refer to kids either. Like, this is how we teach people, all throughout life. A lot of times, I'm sure if you try to teach somebody something, you show them how to do it. That's vicarious learning. We also have what is called vicarious reinforcement. So you can think of it the same way. Vicarious means, through somebody else, basically. So vicarious reinforcement is where we see the consequences of a behavior for somebody else. So when someone else carries out a behavior, we pay attention to what happens to them. Do they get rewarded? Do they get punished? Right? What happens because of that behavior? And I learn from that. right? So again, we mentioned in that last one, in the last slide, that when I see somebody else get rewarded, that makes it more likely that I'm going to follow a behavior. So again, if let's say, for example, you're in a class, right? One thing that we notice is if, let's say we're all in a classroom and I'm teaching and I give somebody some sort of reward, it could be praise, it could be candy, whatever. I give them some sort of reward for doing a behavior. It's more likely that the rest of you will also do that behavior, right? So I've actually seen this with our daily psychology, that little extra credit assignment I give you guys. So when I started doing it last year, what I would notice is when somebody would come in and turn in a bunch of them, so they would come in with like a few and they would turn them in, I would get a lot more people that would take we used to use little slips of paper, they would take the paper with them, right? What's happening is they're noticing that behavior and they're seeing the reward that they get, right? I also used to post them on the wall. So all of a sudden when a new kind of like batch would go up on the wall, people all of a sudden would go and take the slips and want to do the assignment, right? So they were seeing the consequences of a behavior, and then that was, increasing the likelihood that they would do the behavior. Okay, so again, modeling is a form of, showing someone how to do something and then them copying it. One thing I do want to mention is there is a lot of cognitive stuff that's going on here. So depending on what kind of thing you teach, you may notice some of the cognitive aspects where it's not necessarily always that just we see something and then we're able to copy it exactly, right? There can be a lot of other things that have to go into, understanding what I'm doing that can also be an important part. And that's where it does mention that, right? It also has a cognitive basis. So I can show you how to do something, but if you don't know why you're doing it or what you're really doing, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be great at doing it right away. Okay, so that's going to wrap up this last section. So again, take some time, do a short summary on observational learning, and then that will be the last piece for this unit.